Once again, good morning. Let's get started. You have joined the Great Lakes PTTC for leveraging AI chatbots for substance misuse prevention data analysis and reporting with Brian Kloss. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes PTTC under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services. I want to share a few housekeeping items. If you have technical issues, please individually message me, Rebecca Buller, in the chat section, and I will do my best to be helpful. If you have questions for Brian while we're going through our webinar today, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. This will help us not lose them as we use the chat for different kinds of responses and it rolls by. We don't want to lose your questions. If captions would be helpful, please use your Zoom toolbar near the bottom of your screen and choose live transcript. AI note takers are not allowed in our trainings and they will be removed from the Zoom room. And certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to those who attend the session in full. And now I'm going to turn things over to Brian Kloss, who is the Assistant Director for Technology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health Center for Teaching and Learning.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Chris, very, very much. Always happy to be here to be talking to the good people at Great Lakes PTTC. Just as a quick note before we get started, I have the distinct pleasure of living in Rincon, Puerto Rico. It's a beautiful place. I love it here. But reliable electrical infrastructure is a challenge for Puerto Rico, in case you were not aware. And we got a notice last night that the local power company, Luma, will be working in my area today, possibly shutting off power. Well, the good news is that even if they do that, we have a generator and Starlink as a backup internet service. So if I suddenly disappear for 5 minutes, you'll know why. Rebecca and Chris are aware of this, but hopefully this won't happen because it takes about 5 minutes for me to run outside, turn on the generator, switch the switch, and then get Starlink back online. But hopefully it won't be too disruptive and hopefully it won't even happen at all. So there we go. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides here today. Hopefully you can see them. And if I start breaking up in terms of audio or anything like that, please just type in the text chat so I know that there's our problems with my internet connection, because again, that is sometimes a challenge here. So this is something I teach about. Data analysis and reporting is something that I teach about in my role as a faculty member at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So I am a faculty member there. I teach a bunch of different classes, and I actually teach about data visualization and data communication to non-expert audiences is a big part of what I teach and what I do. And I love talking about this. And I think really this is a key skill for anybody in public health or the health sciences, and certainly in substance misuse prevention. And the primary narrative around generative AI right now, at least from a daily work perspective, is that generative AI chatbots are supposed to help us become super productive, right? We don't need to hire interns or assistants because generative AI chatbots can, at least according to the companies who make them, do all the work that an entry or even mid-level assistant should be able to do. Well, the reality, there's some truth to that narrative on some level, but the reality is somewhat different. So take a look at this image, if you would, please. This is an example dashboard that I created 2 weeks ago using Google Gemini's new state-of-the-art image generator. Do you notice anything off in this dashboard image? Maybe the weird text, maybe the weird repeated labels of some of the charts, maybe the utterly bizarre patient flow and outcomes panel that's in there. So generative AI chatbots have a lot of power to perform data analysis, visualization, and reporting, but they really have to be very carefully managed. They easily make mistakes and sometimes invent utter garbage data. And math, well, at least non-theoretical, non-symbolic math is not their strong suit, even if they are great analysts and pattern recognizers. They can't really replace humans yet in daily knowledge work, but they can act as a helpful assistant. And so it's my overarching goal today that you leave this session armed with the ability to use generative AI chatbots in some of your daily substance misuse prevention work, and I'll tell you, the reporting capabilities of generative AI tools are really impressive, and Google is developing a new tool that's really quite amazing. But I also hope that you use these tools with a critical eye and armed with some of the knowledge about the pitfalls you're going to encounter while using the tools. And learning how to use generative AI in an ethical, responsible way when performing data analysis or creating visualizations and reports definitely takes time and practice. But I expect you to be able to leave this session today able to analyze prevention data using generative AI chatbots, create basic data visualizations with just a data file and a prompt, and hopefully articulate the power behind these deep research tools in generative AI chatbots that can really save you hours or days of preparatory work. But before we get into all that, using it for data analysis, data visualization, and reporting, I need to make sure on some level that everyone's on the same page in terms of what these tools are and how they work. And now, if you attended my training for the Great Lakes PTTC about generative AI last week, this next short segment is going to be a little repetitive. But if not, please pay attention because I will assume you understand these things as we move into demonstrations and activities working with these tools. And I'm going to try to avoid answering really basic questions about how these tools work because, again, that was covered in the webinar from last week. So tools like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude are all powered by something called a large language model. What is a large language model? Well, I can explain it, or we can ask Claude, one of the tools. So a basic prompt, what you type into the chatbot of what is a large language model tells me that it's a kind of artificial intelligence that's trained on vast amounts of text, and I would also add images and video, and learns statistical patterns and relationships within that text or even that video. And that's a really simple, concise explanation of how tools like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude itself actually work. So these tools are really about modeling patterns, discovering and modeling patterns so that a system that uses this large language model underneath can wind up giving reasonable responses to our questions. And a large language model's ability to recognize patterns is part of what makes it so useful for data analysis. You can dump multiple Excel files into a chatbot, and it can find patterns across the data in those files that's really hard for an average human to see or discern on their own. But large language models' ability to recognize patterns is also really their Achilles heel. Linguist Emily Bender coined the term stochastic parrots to describe large language models and their chatbot front ends. Tools like ChatGPT generate human-like text by statistically mimicking patterns in their training data, the text that they read, but without any real understanding of the meaning of that text or the meaning of those documents. So these tools process and replicate linguistic forms based on probability rather than semantic comprehension. And this lack of understanding can lead to output that's convincing, but potentially made up, biased, or socially inappropriate, as these tools are merely reflecting the data that they were trained on. So when we work with tools like ChatGPT or Gemini, we always have to keep in mind that the output, while very convincing and very human-like, might be completely wrong. And another key issue we need to keep in mind when working with these tools that power chatbots like ChatGPT or Claude is that how you communicate with them has a direct and material impact on the quality and accuracy of the output from these tools. So a prompt is what you type into a generative AI's a chatbot's input box, right? The box where you type stuff. That's your prompt. And it could be a question like, what's the best way to get from San Diego to Rincon, Puerto Rico? Or a command like, write a full grant proposal for the Otsego Community Foundation requesting $50,000 to expand the refuge's winter homeless shelter services in Gaylord, Michigan, right? But how you write that prompt actually matters. And there's no single 100% guaranteed framework for writing a prompt that gives you excellent, factually accurate results every single time you use a generative AI chatbot. But there are a couple things you should keep in mind every time you do write a prompt, and I would like you to keep in mind during today's session. So first up, be specific. Don't just write, I work at a nonprofit. How can I get more donors? Instead, give lots of detail. Say, my substance misuse prevention nonprofit in Columbus, Ohio is worried about a donor death spiral. Since 2018, we've seen a significant drop in large donor contributions. Provide me 3 strategies we can use to avoid this donor death spiral and contrast the strengths and weaknesses of each. That level of detail will give you a vastly more helpful and more actionable and more accurate result. Second thing, include an action word like create, compare, generate, make. So these action words direct the tools to generate actionable output. So instead of just kind of information dumping, they might give you, information that might be relevant. But when you include these kinds of words, it helps you to and helps the tool to solve a problem or take an action. And most of us are using these tools to solve problems. Third, role play, sort of. Tell it who it is, and the large language model will infer a set of skills and, more importantly, a specific kind of writing style. If it's told to act as an expert in a topic area like emergent use of nitazines, it's going to give you a very different perspective and response than if you tell it that it's a high school principal reviewing a letter sent to parents about nitazine use by school students. And then finally, unless you're performing a purely creative task, always force web search. So web search is not on by default, especially if you're using the free versions of ChatGPT or Claude. Google Gemini always has web search enabled though. And you want to enable this because it's going to force the tool to go out and search the web when creating your answers, rather than just sort of guessing and thinking it knows what the appropriate references or sources are. And because large language models can be weirdly lazy, you also have to include telling the tool to search the web in your prompt, like in the actual text you type. If you don't, it might not actually search the web, even though you have web search enabled. And this also, if you also do something like telling it to focus on high quality sources, that improves the quality of the output, and also helps to ground that output in evidence-based research. So if you do these four things when writing your prompts for a tool like ChatGPT, you're going to get much better and much more directly actionable results. So keep these strategies in mind as you work through the activities in today's session, if you can. And finally, I just want to mention, I use these tools every day. Many of you use them, but I think the sort of simple and unfortunate reality is that these tools give you the best responses when you pay for them. You're going to get access to better models, better tools, and will be able to use these tools longer before you run into the usage limits that are really common in these kinds of tools. And if you want to really see the magic of these generative AI tools, ultimately you have to pay for them. And I know that $20 a month can seem like a lot, but I like to say, if you save 5 hours of your work time a month by using the paid version of one of these tools, isn't that 5 hours worth $20? For me, it is. All right. So moving on. And again, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A pod. I'll gladly answer those questions for you, as we go along, and also be sort of, well, yeah, put the questions in the Q&A pod. That's a better place for them. So I want to get started here. Let's get into what we want to talk about now that we're 10 minutes in here, talking about using generative AI for data analysis and reporting. And in the context of data analysis and reporting, generative AI is good for data cleaning and transformation, pattern recognition across data sets, data visualization creation, and natural language report generation. And we're going to cover all of these things in today's webinar. But first, I need to emphasize two directives, which all of us, anyone who uses generative AI chatbots for data analysis and reporting, need to follow. And I'm not going to tell you to repeat after me with these two directives, but they're really important if you're doing data analysis or really anytime you're working with generative AI chatbots. And the first one is to view all generated output through a critical lens. Generative AI makes things up. It creates misinformation. It can and does create disinformation every time you ask it to create an image or a video that mimics the real world. I mean, you don't want to be that lawyer or that student or that researcher who asks ChatGPT a question and then uses the output as is without any critical evaluation and review. Generative AI can have deep bias. I give a 90-minute lecture on that topic of bias and harms in the use of generative AI in one of my classes at Johns Hopkins, and that lecture barely scratches the surface of the topic. And in the substance misuse prevention arena, this is a major concern. Any AI-driven analysis or recommendation must be carefully examined for unfair bias against specific communities or groups. For example, if an AI tool learned from historically biased law enforcement data, it might suggest increased surveillance in minority neighborhoods simply because those neighborhoods were over-policed in the past, not because of current need. So you have to treat everything that comes out of generative AI with a skeptical eye. You can trust, but you also have to validate. And keeping vigilant about this is hard to do because we come to trust these tools and accept their output is correct or even unbiased the more that we use them. And the second directive is keep personally identifying information and data out of generative AI tools. Data security experts strongly advise against entering sensitive personal health information into public AI chatbots, as it's going to violate privacy laws like HIPAA, along with federal, state, and local agency policies, and potentially expose that data to unauthorized party. Now, you can turn off the training of generative AI tools like ChatGPT or Google Gemini on your data, but data security is still a critical concern. This requires anonymizing or aggregating all, and I mean all data before you put it into a generative AI chatbot, using on-premises or privacy-preserving AI tools where possible, if they're offered by your employer or your agency, and then continually updated training and knowledge sharing, really important knowledge sharing about what not to share with generative AI between you and your peers in prevention. If you can establish communities of practice around this, that is a huge win for you and your teams if you're going to be using generative AI for data analysis. Okay, so with these two directives firmly in mind, let's finally jump into how we can use generative AI chatbots for data analysis. And we're going to get to reporting later in today's webinar. The first half is going to be on data analysis. And let's start by using generative AI for analyzing existing data. And we're going to look at two different ways of doing this: multimodal analysis and then more traditional data analysis. So I want to start this section on analyzing existing data with something other than an Excel file or a CSV spreadsheet. So while we tend to think of generative AI chatbots like ChatGPT and Claude as focusing on text because they are chatbots after all, they have really powerful capabilities for seeing, I put that in big quotes because they don't have eyes, they don't have an ocular system, but they can see images or videos. Information in images or videos can be analyzed by these tools for pattern analysis and even data extraction. And we run into a lot of visualizations in our daily public health and substance misuse work. These visualizations don't always provide easy access to the underlying source data, or if you're using a tool like Google to search for visualizations, you might lack any context for what the visualization really means. And you can do image searches in Google to find out where an image came from, but you can ask a generative AI chatbot like ChatGPT to explore and extrapolate from that visualization with you. So here we have a line chart created by the Michigan Department of Public Health and Human Services in the inaugural issue of their Opioid Task Force News Brief. It's a line chart that plots the mortality rate per 100,000 Michigan residents separated by race and ethnicity between 2011 and 2023. Now, overall line trends in this line chart might be pretty obvious to us, right? There's a example. There's a rise in Black deaths, a low rate of Asian Pacific Islander deaths, and so on. But what if I want to know more about this visualization and the story or stories it's telling? Why is it that in this visualization, American Indians and Alaska Natives have a steady drop in deaths in Michigan after 2018? Well, I can ask a generative AI chatbot like ChatGPT to help me figure that out. So I tell ChatGPT, you're an expert in illicit drug use trends analysis. I tell it what the line chart means. I say, analyze this image, explain the major trend lines in this image to me, and then explain why there's a downward trend in AIA and NH deaths since 2018. Cite specific sources which back up your explanations. And these slides are available on the Great Lakes PTTC website. You'll definitely get a copy of them, so you don't have to worry about screenshotting this or getting it down here. And in all these examples there. Now, for this particular prompt, I use the more advanced thinking version of GPT-5.1 and turned on web search, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that ChatGPT actually searched the web for the answers. Now, I probably could have left out the whole sentence explaining what the line chart represents and receive the same answer, because ChatGPT, like Claude or Gemini, can read all the text in the image and infer what the data represents from that. So in this case, ChatGPT starts off by performing a straightforward analysis of what we can already kind of like pretty much determine ourselves from the line chart. But then it asks itself the question, why might the AIAN-NH death rate, decline in Michigan after about 2018? And this is where things get interesting. It starts off by pointing to the possibility of statistical noise or misclassification for small populations. And this is a real issue in public health surveillance data. Marginalized populations are often overlooked or misrepresented in data collection due to a wide range of factors, not the least of which is trust between these populations and health surveillance systems. And then GPT-5.1 then goes on to compare national trends against those found in the line chart and points out that nationally the trend for AI and overdoses has gone upwards at a much faster rate than other races or and ethnicities. And it suggests that there could be a local prevention programs that help reduce overdose deaths, but that it could find no authoritative source in its web search showing that there was an AI and targeted overdose prevention program that would line up with this decline starting in 2018. And then GPT-5.1 goes on to offer a little more analysis and wraps up with a list of information that would help clarify the data and help us get us our answer as to why there was this decline in the overdose deaths post 2018. And it finishes by asking me, it says, hey, should I go out and look and find Michigan specific AI and death tables to confirm the validity of the trend? And I think it's pretty helpful, right? It's kind of nice that it is. So I was like, yes, please do that. Go ahead, go to work and do that. So after a few minutes, it comes back and says that it cannot find a reliable publicly available table that shows annual counts of overdose deaths in Michigan by race and ethnicity. It lists what it can find and where potential data reporting gaps might be. And finally, it says that maybe the trend represented by in the chart doesn't reflect reality, which is an interesting take on things from a generative AI chatbot that makes up words and statistical patterns. I would have assumed that the trends in the report in this chart were valid, but maybe now I have to stop and think before designing interventions or taking other actions based off this chart. So while ChatGPT wasn't able to answer our original question, what's the reason for this downward trend, it did raise a whole host of issues I never would have thought of otherwise. And it did so in a fairly logical and reasonable way. I didn't have to do the research. ChatGPT did it for me. And if you want to see this whole conversation in the slides that you can download and get that are linked in the chat there, you'll see a link to this chat on ChatGPT, and you can see the whole thing and spend time reading it if that's something you'd like to do. So what if I ask Gemini, Google Gemini, the same question? Will the mighty Google search engine that's embedded into Gemini help me find data that ChatGPT couldn't? Well, I did that, and Google Gemini came back with a similar breakdown of trend lines in the graph, but it diverged from ChatGPT's answer when responding to the question, why the drop in AI and overdoses? And Gemini references tribal opioid response grants, naloxone distribution, and opioid settlement funds as reasons why AI and overdose rates declined. It also cites the same issue that ChatGPT cited, that the national data often shows AI and overdose rates increasing, which goes against the data in this line chart. But Gemini then goes on to provide the same caution that ChatGPT did. There's a very small sample size population, and we need to interpret the AI and trend line in that chart with caution. And Gemini still says that the reason for the downward trend is targeted interventions, but doesn't really provide better evidence for that than ChatGPT. So again, we have an interesting analysis that leads me to believe that maybe I should not trust the data as it is in the chart, or try to unearth more information about targeted interventions to AI and populations in Michigan, maybe by reaching out to my colleagues in the Michigan State Department of Public Health or something like that. So that's one example of how you can use these tools for data analysis, for sort of visual analyzing an existing visualization. What about a more complex data visualization where we don't really have any underlying data? Can we extract something totally different from an existing visualization? So yeah, I think we can. So here's a choropleth map of counties in Michigan that tries to show the relationship between the overdose death rate per 100,000 people and total naloxone boxes per county, like out in the counties. And there's some additional information about overdose deaths in specific counties with the naloxone boxes, but those data points don't exist for all counties in the map. So what can we learn from this? What can we learn from this visualization? Is there a correlation across counties between overdose deaths and the existence of naloxone boxes in those counties? Because that's not something that this visualization answers for us. So this time I asked Claude to perform this analysis. And I said, analyze this choropleth map of counties in Michigan, extract the overdose death rate per 100,000 people, and plot that against total naloxone boxes per county. Exclude any counties that do not have at least one naloxone box, because that wasn't interesting there for me. And what's interesting about Claude is that it's very transparent as a tool about how it does this work. Claude uses the Python programming language to extract the data from the original image and then uses a different set of Python code to perform the data analysis. So if you happen to use Python to use data analysis in your work, this is an incredibly valuable learning tool about learning to do this on your own. For most of us, though, we're interested only in the output, the results, and Claude gives us two different versions of the data that it extracts. First is a table of data that it was able to extract from that map. And then it gives us a series of observations about what it was able to extract. And the key point here is that the relationship between counties with more naloxone boxes having lower death rates is not strong. So thinking back to that original image, is that something we would have been able to, that have been clear to you, right? Looking at that map of Michigan and the colors and the boxes, would that have been clear to you? You could have tried to manually extract the data and do the comparison, but Claude did this work for me in about 2 minutes. And the second thing Claude did for me is to create a scatter plot that shows the relationship between overdose deaths and naloxone boxes per county. And according to Claude, the scatter plot doesn't perfectly align with overdose death rates, suggesting opportunities to better target resources to high need areas like Wayne or Genesee County. Genesee is a little bit buried at the very top of that scatter plot by Claude there. So again, I think here we can see the power of generative AI chatbots to perform analysis on existing graphs, charts, and tables. You still have to validate their findings, usually by doing a verification of sources cited or asking a different chatbot to do the same work and compare responses. But this kind of analysis can be a whole lot faster and potentially more insightful than doing this work on your own. Okay, so now it's time for an activity. We're going to put this into practice. Everybody loves an activity, right? And we're going to be doing a number of activities in this webinar. And in this activity, you're going to take a public health visualization, upload it to a chatbot, and ask it to explain a key trend in that visualization. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. All right, so here's the visualization we're going to be using. It's a choropleth or color-coded map of the drug overdose deaths in the United States in 2023. Darker colors represent higher rates, and lighter colors represent lower rates. And I posted this original image in the chat, so you can go ahead and download it. So please go ahead and download it now if you didn't already download it off of the website, off the Great Lakes PTTC website, because you're going to need it on your computer in order to do this activity. Okay. So your job is to use ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, you pick whichever one you want to do to analyze this image. All right. So that's what you're going to do. And here's some questions that you can ask, right? You could ask, why does Indiana have a lower overdose death rate than Illinois? Or tell it to group the data by geographic region and make a bar chart from this data, or explain the major regional trends in this chart using citations from government publications and websites. Again, you don't have to ask these specific questions. You can come up with the data analysis questions on your own, right? You are public health professionals, you're substance misuse prevention professionals. You can come up with other interesting questions about this. So I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes to do this work. I'll be quiet. I'll turn off my audio. I'll turn off my video. So I'd like you to spend 5 minutes. You upload this again to one of the chatbots. It doesn't matter which one, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, whichever one you want to use. And hopefully when the time is up, hopefully some of you will share your experience, what you asked it, and what you thought about the results. Okay? So I'm going to start my clock now, and I'll see you in 5 minutes. All right. If anybody would like to copy their prompt into the webinar chat there, or just talk about what they did and what they thought of the analysis given back by the chatbot, that would be awesome. I'd love to hear your experiences. If you just want to share the prompt, or again, type in a little bit about what you learned or what it found for you from using that same visualization, that would be great, because learning from your peers is a good thing. Yeah. There you go. In this chart, why does Nevada have a higher drug rate overdose deaths than California? That is a good question, right? And hopefully, ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever tool you used actually did web search and didn't just sort of make stuff up there. That's why forcing web search is really important and useful, especially when you're asking it to do this kind of data analysis on trends, because it needs that social, economic, cultural, data-driven context to come up with something useful there. Let's see. Madeline said, "You're a health promotion specialist with expertise in drug overdose trends." Good. This map represents the rate of drug overdose deaths. Explain the major regional trends in this chart using citations from government publications and websites. So, Madeline, did it actually use government publications and websites in its response to you? Yep, it referenced CDC and SAMHSA. Good, excellent. I'm glad it actually did the work. And Adam, thank you for sharing your whole chat in there. That's one of the really nice things about pretty much all the chatbots now, is that if you're working on a conversation in a tool like ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini, you can actually share that whole chat with your colleagues, with your work partners, whoever it might be, and you can see the whole thing. So right now, I have Adam's whole chat on the screen in there. I was asking about Georgia, and then it gives me some context about Georgia's overdose death rate, and then some reasons why relative rates might differ across states. And it focuses on differences in drug supply, state public health responses and interventions, and then, of course, variations in demography and risk factors, and then law enforcement approaches there. Yeah. So, again, it's really cool to be able to share this. And you can do this with ChatGPT, Claude, or Google Gemini to be able to share those chats with your peers, and that's kind of cool as well. Yeah, so it also, so Christine said that that chat that they did also from Gemini also shared info from CDC and IDPH, which is great. So, I mean, I hope you can see, like, this is one way of approaching data analysis, right? If you don't understand, and also I'll tell you, I do not have a PhD. And sometimes I get very, very intricately detailed graphs, tables, and charts from my colleagues at Johns Hopkins. And sometimes I don't understand them. And what I'll do is I'll be like, please explain this chart to me. Like, I'll do a screenshot or extract that image or that table and be like, what does this mean? Please explain to me like I'm a high school sophomore, is one of my favorite things to do. And it gives me great explanations. So that is really good. Yeah, so Brendan points out that originally Gemini just made code, not a bar chart, but if you turn on Canvas, you can have it make an interactive dashboard with the data. Yes, so both all the major tools, Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, have a sort of Canvas built in, a tool called Canvas built in that lets you interact with the data in real time, whether you are asking to generate text or do data analysis. And you can sometimes even, there's even an interactive controls to change some of the values that are in that data set if you turn on the Canvas tool, which is very, very cool and very helpful. All right. Well, hopefully that was a useful tool. So Najat asked the excellent question: do I get permission from my colleagues to put their charts in AI? Yes, if I know it's something that's not been published, and if it has been published, basically I just sort of use it anyways. But I also have on all of my tools, I have the option to not train future models on my prompts and input data. I have that enabled. None of the tool, I don't like it using my personal data to train it for future versions of ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini. So I'm already enabling that as a privacy preserving mechanism for myself in all of my work. And I would encourage you to do the same. That just definitely helps. Um, yeah. So someone asked me in the chat, this is a great question. How would you recommend navigating the recent updates to some government websites that may have made changes to information to align with certain ideologies as opposed to peer-reviewed science when leveraging chatbots for these analyses? I think it's a great question. That's one of the reasons why I'm showing examples largely from, like, say, 2020 through 2024 in today's website, much less, publications or anything from 2025. So, I tend to put more of an effort and emphasis on peer-reviewed journals, the scientific literature. Claude actually has like an option where it's like just search the scientific literature that it has access to. Now you got to understand that a lot of the scientific literature is behind paywalls, right? Companies like Elsevier want to make money off these things. But stuff that has been published in the past generally hasn't been altered. I think we have to worry about that more right now. So I try to say, website data or data from 2024 and previous years, because unfortunately at this point, I don't know how much we can trust with 2025 data from the federal government. Local states are slightly different. But I do put an emphasis on searching the scientific literature where possible, because at least I know those are peer-reviewed studies. So that's how I answer that issue or deal with that issue there. So thank you for putting that question in the Q&A, whoever put it in there. All right, so I want to move on here because we've got lots more to cover. So generative AI chatbots are pretty good at looking at data and explaining the trends or exploring the sort of the data underlying a visualization. But they're even stronger when taking an existing data set and performing an analysis on it, which is what I'd like to turn to right now. So the data set I'm going to use I'm going to share with you in just a moment here, comes from wonder.cdc.gov and focuses on drug-induced causes of death by state between 2018 and 2023. And I downloaded this data set actually last year, and I've had it on my computer since then. So in this screenshot, you can see that we have the state, the year, the cause of death, a cause code, total number of deaths from that cause, the population of the state, and the crude death rate for that year in that state. And I usually start off by giving the chatbot a little context and ensuring that it's correctly reading the file and that it understands basic organizational and grouping of the data in the file. It's important to start with this task, I think, to ensure that the generative AI chatbot properly kind of like reads the data in the Excel file and that it doesn't skip or miss any columns in the data set, especially if it's a larger file. And GPT-5.1 did a good job with this, and I saw no problems in the overview. And I then tell it to perform some basic aggregation and to group deaths by geographic regions in the United States. It does this grouping for me and then gives me the results of performing aggregation on the data in a table, which I can then download if I want. Now note that I don't have to re-upload a new file each time I ask it to manipulate the data. It keeps whatever changes I ask for in memory and works from that on each subsequent prompt in my conversation. Because you're going to need to have conversations, right, with generative AI chatbots to get the results you want, not just enter one prompt to do everything. It doesn't usually work out that way. So I ask it to perform this aggregation and then tell me the specific trends it sees in each geographic region between 2021 and 2023. And then ChatGPT does a basic trend analysis on the data by geographic region, which was really the second part of my prompt. And it goes from region to region, indicating key trends in the region, starting in the Northeast and then going to Southeast, Upper Midwest, and then finally to the South lower Midwest, Southwest, and then the Northwest on the West Coast there. And it wraps up by giving me a nationally focused summary narrative stating that the national overdose burden is no longer rising everywhere, but is shifted predominantly to the Northwest. And again, it's just analyzing my Excel file to get this information and then pulling out additional context from what it has in its knowledge base and searching the web. And now to follow up, I want to know why the Northwest would have a sharp increase. And again, even if you have web search tool enabled in ChatGPT, you still have to remind it that it can actually search the web and get up-to-date information to consider. And this also helps, again, with references and verifying cited sources. So I say, look at the data in the Northwest, exclude Alaska and Hawaii. Is there still a sharp increase? If yes, search the web and come back with 5 sources that suggest why there's a sharp increase in this region between 2021 and 2023. And so it starts out by saying that, yeah, there's still an increase even after removing Alaska and Hawaii from the data set. And then it goes on to answer my real question. Find explanations for this increase using verifiable web-based sources. And it comes up with a number of reasons for this rise in deaths. First, the rapid dominance of illicitly manufactured fentanyl in Washington and Oregon. Second, a westward shift of the fentanyl epidemic from the East Coast and Appalachia to the West Coast. Third, changing drug use patterns, more smoking and more polysubstance use. Fourth, homelessness and unstable housing, especially in Oregon. And then finally, criminal drug networks in Mexico flooding the West Coast with fentanyl-laced pills. And I can click on any of the references cited, any of the references it found on the web to verify that the references are real, that maybe they haven't been altered in the last year or so, and that ChatGPT understood the content of these supporting references correctly. So I hope you can see, I mean, this is a very simple example, but I hope you can see how you can have conversations with your data in Excel files. It just doesn't have to be about trend analysis, but trend analysis goes along great with large language models' ability to contextualize those trends within larger social, economic, political, or even cultural events. But I want to sort of mention here an important caveat. When you're working with Excel or CSV files or PDFs or really any file in tools like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, and that's you have to be careful about the amount of data you try to get these tools to analyze. If you give the tool too much data to analyze in a single file, it either won't be able to process all of the data and give you an analysis based on an incomplete understanding of that data, or it won't be able to process the data set at all and just kind of error out and be like, sorry, it's too big. I can't do anything about that. And this is because all generative AI chatbots, all of them, not just with data analysis, not just with like analyzing images, but all generative AI chatbots are limited something called the context window. And the context window is the amount of information that a system can keep in its working memory, for lack of a better term, because these are not humans. They don't have working memory like we do, but I'll call it working memory. And while this can be a lot of data, it has hard limits. And once those limits are reached, the generative AI tool will start to forget what was discussed earlier in the same conversation. So if you've ever had like a really long conversation with a generative AI chatbot and it starts to forget what you talked about earlier in the conversation, you've run into the limits of that context window. So if you're going to give a generative AI chatbot a really big Excel file to process, that's going to fill up most or all of the context window. So it's not going to work very well for very long, or even if it works at all. So where possible, break apart big data sets into manageable chunks for the chatbot to be able to process. Even with a 2 million token or word window in a context window in a tool like Google Gemini, you're going to work faster and smarter if you work with subsets of data rather than giant data sets, at least when using generative AI. Traditional machine learning techniques generally, well, they don't have this problem, although with the trade-off of not being able to ask simple English language questions about our data. All right, so time for another activity. Woohoo! Here we go. So in this activity, you're going to take the same data file that I just used. So let me actually find this on my computer and put it into the chat here. Okay, I just put it in the chat, so you should be able to download this data file. And you're going to ask the chatbot to perform a basic trend analysis on the data from your state only. So whatever state you are in, ask it to perform a basic trend analysis on the data in that state. Now, this file contains data from all 50 states, but I want you to focus on your state only, right? So please make sure you download the file from the chat right now if you hadn't already downloaded it before. And here are some example questions you can ask. What are the major trends in unintentional overdoses in my state? Or compare my state with a neighboring state. What are the key differences? Search the web to explain those differences. Or how does the overdose due to suicide rate in my state compare to national trends? Again, you don't have to ask these specific questions. You can come up with data analysis questions on your own. Again, I'll give you 5 minutes to do this. Chris very kindly will be putting warnings for how much time is left in the chat, so we can all work quietly. I'll turn my audio and video off, and when we finish up, hopefully again, some of you will share your experience, your prompt, your chat, or this time I'd like to see, what your reaction is really more about the quality of the analysis. Was it interesting? Was it useful? Could you could you analyze your own Excel files to do this kind of work? These are all questions I'd like you to explore when we come back in just 5 minutes, and I'm going to start that 5 minutes right now. All right, welcome back. Hopefully that was an interesting and useful exercise. Anyone want to share their prompt, what they learned, their experience with it? I see that Crystal put in the Q&A pod that the talked about. So Crystal, in the Q&A, I think you put in the Q&A pod and said the chat there about what that you found out, which is that for Iowa, the major trend in overdose deaths are a shift from PX opioids to fentanyl and meth-related deaths. So is that something that you got from your conversation with ChatGPT there? If you want to answer in the chat, that would be great. And if anyone else wants to either type in the prompt or what their experience was doing this data analysis, that would be great. Anybody at all? Oh, so Crystal said lower drug overdose. Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. Great. No worries, Crystal. There's like multiple panels on the screen and it's always a bit challenging. Anybody else want to share what their either their prompt or what their experience was working with the chatbot to do data analysis on this particular file? Was there anything interesting or illuminating that came out? Oh, Brendan says Gemini created charts on its own to answer questions about the major trends for New York State, which I thought was great. I agree. We're going to get actually in just a minute into actually creating data visualizations. And Gemini's, especially for using Gemini Pro, the sort of thinking version of Gemini, it's really good. I mean, you'll see these data visualizations that I came up with, and it does really good work. I'm a little worried for some of the my data visualization class that now they've gotten so good, and that's changed a lot in the last couple of months. Now they've gotten so good that my students could use Google to do that work for me. Yeah, Gemini Pro is really good. The Gemini 3 model is excellent, and I think is in some ways better than the current GPT-5 too, but also in other ways not the best. So Najat, what was the trend analysis like? Yeah, so use GPT and it provided graphs and much more suggestion additional analysis. Well, that's great. Again, I think the power of these tools is unearthing things that we would not be able to spot really easily in the data on our own. Now, I realize this Excel file isn't that big, and it only has a certain number of years and a certain number of cause of death types. But if you're dealing with in your state, every single county in your state or every single city in your county, you'll find data here that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get on your own, and trends or correlations that you would not be able to necessarily see on your own. And I think it's one of the really powerful things about these tools. And yeah, so Christine said Gemini pulled out a lot of good thoughts for the public health response between Illinois and Indiana and how that impacted the overdose deaths in each state. I agree. There's a lot to be found. I mean, I live in Puerto Rico. I lived in Maryland for a long time. If I were to be asked about trends in, let's say, Tennessee, I wouldn't know because I don't have a lot of context for that. But a chatbot like ChatGPT or Gemini can actually pull that context out of for me and say, look, I've even done analysis where you can say, like, look, what policy decisions were made that would have affected these outcomes and going back to those, and figuring out where do we go wrong and how can we affect and change things in the future there. So yeah, I think it's really powerful to do this kind of data analysis on an existing Excel or data CSV file or something like that. That's data that's useful for you. Real quick, everybody, if, Chris or Rebecca is going to launch a funding source poll for the Great Lakes PTTC data that they need. So if you go ahead and answer this poll while I continue to talk, I would greatly appreciate you doing that. This is really important for the Great Lakes PTTC in order to be able to provide the kinds of webinars that they do. So please do respond to this poll while I continue on in my content coverage, if you don't mind, please. Just take about 10 more seconds, let people go ahead and answer the poll there before I move on to my next piece of content, because I want to make sure I finish all my content. Okay. So generative AI chatbots are also really good helpers when it comes to figuring out how to do things in Excel or ArcGIS or RStudio. I mean, we're not going to do all of our data analysis inside of ChatGPT or Google just yet. And sometimes we need help remembering how to do something or figuring out how to achieve a specific objective in Excel, like making pivot tables or performing conditional formatting. So we can start with a relatively straightforward task. Like I'm using the same data set I did before. I want to take a column that has a limited number of options and turn that into a drop-down select, right? Now, I don't personally work in Excel frequently enough to remember how to do this off the top of my head. So I asked ChatGPT, like, explain to me in simple step-by-step terms how I turn this into a drop-down list. And because I'm a lazy human and didn't want to do this work on my own, I asked ChatGPT to do the work for me. But I also don't 100% trust the output. So I downloaded the file, followed the instructions, and and it worked, and it worked there. And while and Excel has some nice, easy to use conditional formatting tools, sometimes we need more complex set of formatting or requirements for formatting. So in this case, I wanted conditional formatting based on values in other rows. And that's not something Excel can really do on its own very easily. And I couldn't figure it out. So I asked ChatGPT how to do it, and it came up with a pretty good solution. Like I wanted to color code some rows red if the value was in a specific range, and some rows yellow if the value was in a different range. And again, ChatGPT does this. And it does this by it tells me to create a new intermediary column that calculates the year over year delta or change. And then base the conditional formatting off the values in the new column. Now, I don't know that I would have come up with a solution myself, but ChatGPT solved this problem for me in just a couple of seconds. And keep in mind that while you absolutely can perform a Google search that asks a similar question, doing this in a tool like ChatGPT or Claude gives you the option of uploading the actual data file itself and getting a solution specifically tailored to that file using your specific column names, which is something you cannot do with a Google search. This is what I think makes it being so powerful when you want to learn about formula, when you want to learn about formatting or whatever, things that we don't do every day in Excel. And in this case, ChatGPT asked if it wanted to do the work for me, and I said yes, and it gave me this Excel file to download, and it almost worked, almost, except that the formula assumed that the year over year change value column would actually be in percentage format. The column was a numeric format, and so it made every cell in the deaths column turn red. But once I changed that year over year percent change column to a percentage format, everything worked perfectly. So it wasn't 100% right out of the gate, but with really minimal effort on my part and not having to remember how to do this conditional formatting or figuring out how to calculate that delta, I saved a lot of time with this data set. And again, you can do this with not only formatting or drop downs, but also, again, Excel formula to solve a data calculation problem that you might have. So don't forget, these are great tools for that. So I want to finish up this section by talking about using generative AI chatbots to actually create data visualizations, which is something that I think it was Najat did. Yeah, Najat and a couple other people got some actual visualizations there, which is great. And in my example, I'm going to use the same data set once again, now that we're all sort of familiar with it here, or at least have used it on your own. And so I start off with a little role playing to get the chatbot into the right context. I wanted to take the data and give me ideas for data visualizations that I can then work through and explore. And just to mix things up, I'm going to use Google Gemini for this work. Not that, well, Gemini is in some ways a little bit better than ChatGPT at this, but it's sort of a back and forth here. And I wanted to provide some variety here for you. And this is Najat had asked me in the Q&A, what's my favorite chatbot, which one provides the most insightful analysis or in-depth analysis. And there isn't one that does it right for everything. So all the major companies, I mean, and by the major companies, I mean Google Gemini, ChatGPT from OpenAI, and Claude from Anthropic. They are constantly trying to outdo each other and do each other, do better than one another. So about 3-4 weeks ago, Google Gemini came out with the Gemini 3 model, which was a qualitative improvement over what you would get out of ChatGPT. And a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, Gemini is the best. Well, last week, 5 days ago, OpenAI releases the GPT 5.2 model, right? And it's better than Google Gemini 3 on something. So there's this constant back and forth. So it's really difficult to say that one tool does it the best, right? One tool does it the best. That's not the case because in a month, Anthropic, the makers of Claude, could release, and I've actually seen a preview of some new tools that they're releasing specifically around like research and analysis that are going to blow away what you can do in Google Gemini or in ChatGPT right now. And eventually, Gemini and ChatGPT will adopt those same approaches, and you'll have the same set of tools and all of the different chatbots. So it's hard to say there's one that does the best. For me, honestly, I think, in my experience, I really like ChatGPT for data analysis specifically. Gemini for data visualization is really where it's at, and I think you'll see why in just a minute here when I show this here. Um, so back to my topic. So Gemini here is pretty good at giving me a bunch of visualization options and providing me with the reason why I might want to use a specific kind of visualization, which is helpful because I didn't really specify a goal for my visualization, which, as any data visualization designer will tell you, and what I tell my students in my data visualization class, is really important. You got to have a goal with your visualization, right? If it's going to be effective, it has to have a goal. So I asked it to create a heat map for me because heat maps are really powerful at finding outliers really fast. And I have to be careful though, because if the crude rate column is used in its analysis, there's a mix of numeric data and the word unreliable in that column if you look at it in the Excel file. And the tools that Gemini or ChatGPT use to create these visualizations will completely error out if this mixing of data types is not accounted for in some way. And you can see the results pretty good. I mean, again, I mentioned I've been working with generative AI chatbots for 3 years, and I'll tell you, their ability to create visualizations has greatly, and I mean greatly, improved in the last year. I can quickly see here that West Virginia has a much higher unintentional overdose crude rate than any other state, and that the District of Columbia isn't very far behind. Now, the problem with this visualization, as you're most likely experiencing right now, is that it simply contains too much data for both my purposes and the ability to be legible in a presentation format. I also think that legend gradient bar on the right side of the chart makes it appear the data is ordered from highest to lowest, which it is absolutely not. So I asked Gemini, redo the visualization to focus only on the Great Lakes region and move the legend bar to the bottom of the visualization, which it happily does for me. Now, I mean, I know technically Pennsylvania and New York abut one of the Great Lakes, but they're not, in my thought in head about defining what the Great Lakes region is, not really something I would do there. And Michigan is excluded for some reason. But again, this is easily enough to fix. So I tell it enough to redo the visualization with these changes and to move the gradient bar legend to the bottom of that heat map. Okay, so now we have a heat map focusing on just the states of interest. We can see that Ohio clearly stands out from the others, with Indiana being a problem area at the height of the pandemic. And because I'm concerned about accessibility, because accessibility is a public health issue, I think the font size, especially in each cell, is a bit small for each PowerPoint presentation. So as you can see here, right, the font size is a little small there. So I tell Gemini to make the font bigger, which it does. So I think this is turned out pretty well, and the results are strong. And again, I'm using the Gemini 3 with the thinking option enabled. And that's one of the best models available today. You won't necessarily have access to this model if you're using the free version of Gemini. So model choice really matters when you're creating visualizations. Lower end models that aren't like the best ones, the thinking ones, really right now will not create visualizations with the same level of quality. So let's try creating a different visualization using the same data. Now, one of the other items in the original list created by Gemini was a scatter plot accident versus intent visualization. And the purpose of the visualization is to explore the relationship between accidental overdoses and suicide overdoses. And the question is, do states with high accidental overdose rates also have high suicide rates? Maybe indicating broad systemic despair or public health access issues? Or are these totally independent variables? So again, Gemini uses the full data set in the Excel file, which might not be a particular use to me if I want to focus on, say, the Great Lakes region. And you may not be able to see it very well in this setup, but the West Virginia dot is way on the right side of the scatter plot with a much higher unintentional overdose rate than any other state. Why is that? Well, again, one of the cool things in working with generative AI chatbots is that I can take side explorations and ask for answers to related questions, even as I try to accomplish my original task. So I asked Gemini to explain this to me, and I tell it to focus on information from government websites and the scientific literature for an explanation. This is one of those strategies we've mentioned a couple times here today. And Gemini tells me that West Virginia's position as an extreme outlier in the visualization is a well-documented phenomenon often attributed to a, quote, perfect storm of socioeconomic factors and public health failures. Specifically, it focuses on the pill mill legacy and overprescribing, the regional economic collapse, the shift from prescription pills to street fentanyl, and limited healthcare infrastructure in the region. But I want to get back to making my visualization. And again, I only want to focus on the Great Lakes region, which Gemini does for me fairly quickly. And I noticed that this time it didn't include New York and Pennsylvania and included Michigan without me telling it to do so. It remembered, for lack of a better word, the instruction from earlier in my same conversation. And some models for that underlie these tools, excuse me, like Gemini's Nano Banana image model, that's what it's called, Nano Banana, it's part of Gemini 3, are really good at adding in text annotations to data visualizations. So I asked Gemini to add in an annotation that briefly explains why Ohio has a high accidental rate, but a much lower relative suicide rate. And the reason Gemini added for Ohio's higher accidental rate is not the result of higher usage, but a particularly lethal, unadulterated version of fentanyl that made its way into the Ohio region between 2018 and 2013. The high levels of fentanyl in the supply caused a lot more unintentional deaths than in other states. And if I wanted, I could ask Gemini to search high quality sources on the web to back this claim up, but I feel pretty good about the accuracy of the statement. And I really like this visualization at this point in time. So the lesson here is that you're rarely going to get the exact right visualization on your first attempt. And you're going to get a lot more out of brainstorming ideas for visualizations first, instead of just saying like, make a line chart out of this data, as the chatbot might come up with insights on different visualizations that can help you tell a stronger story or make a more persuasive argument. But having a generative AI chatbot makes the visualizations a whole lot faster and simpler than remembering or figuring out how to do this in Excel, as long as you're using a relatively advanced model to do the work. Okay. All right, so time for our last activity. And in this activity, I want you to use that same Excel file that we used for the last exercise, the one you downloaded, to ask ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini to make a bar chart for you. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. And here's some sample prompts you can use. Create a bar chart of deaths for each drug alcohol-induced cause. Show a bar chart of total deaths per state in the Great Lakes region for the year 2023, or show the top 10 states ranked by deaths in 2022. So in the interest of time, I'm only going to give 3 minutes for this because you would just upload the data. Again, you have the data set, you ask the question. It's going to be able to do this for you really quickly. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, but we are running a little short on time and I want to make sure I talk about deep research reports. So we're only going to do this for 3 minutes, okay? So 3 minutes starting now, and I will come back in 3 minutes and see what kind of visualizations and experiences you had there. And I know there's a couple of questions in the Q&A pod. I promise to get to them before or at the end of the webinar. All right. Hopefully, some of you got some visualizations pretty quickly from these tools. Anybody come up with a visualization that you thought was particularly elegant or interesting or useful? You can actually download the images from ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and then you could even upload them into the chat there if that's something. Oh, I don't know. Actually, I don't know that you can upload them in the chat. Maybe you cannot there, or you could share those chats with everybody there. But I think that these tools are actually really, really useful for creating, especially Gemini right now is very, very good for creating these kinds of outputs, data visualization based outputs, which is kind of awesome. Okay, so I want to wrap up today, moving away from data analysis and visualization to using generative AI chatbots for creating detailed reports, deep reporting. And this is where generative AI chatbots are really starting to shine, I think, and why consulting companies like McKinsey are starting to feel nervous about their future. Generative AI chatbots can create highly detailed, strongly annotated reports on scientific topics or sorry, well, scientific or non-scientific, specific topics that really reflect the quality of work of somebody who's getting their master's degree in the topic area in just a couple of minutes. And this screenshot, although it's a lot of text detail, gives you an idea of what they can generate. This report is an analysis of gaps in federal scheduling of emerging synthetic opioids from 2023 Drug Enforcement Agency reports. And these deep research reports, as they're called, are created by scouring the web for relevant sources and key trends, and then synthesizing that information into a detailed report that can run anywhere from 8 to 28 pages, depending on the topic complexity. These reports, in my experience, contain a pretty subtle analysis of complex topics and have the quality of analysis reflective of someone who's been working in that topic area for at least a few years. And again, you can get a copy of these slides, and at the bottom of this particular slide, there's a link to the actual report that was generated. And I'll show you some examples that also have links to reports. And the key thing about these so-called deep research reports is they work really fast. They take a task that could have easily taken a single human being days or weeks to complete and do it in a matter of minutes. It's far from instantaneous. This is one of the reasons we're not going to do a deep research activity in this webinar, but you can go do that on your own because it usually takes about 15, 20 minutes to generate the report. And that's time we don't have today, but it is orders of magnitude faster than you or I could do all on our own. And the big caveat with these deep research reports is that you can only run a really limited number of these reports, like 2 in an entire month, unless you pay for the chatbot service. Now, I mentioned I pay for all the major generative AI chatbots because it's part of my work, but even then, I only get about 15, 20 reports a month in each of the tools. That's more than enough for me, but maybe not enough for an analyst at like Deloitte or PricewaterhouseCooper, right? Again, you very much get what you pay for when you use generative AI chatbots. They have very powerful tools, but in order for those tools to work their best and for you to get the best possible results, you mostly need to pay for them. And here you can see where to enable deep research options in ChatGPT, Claude, and Google Gemini. And you'll sometimes see these buttons highlighted just below the main prompt box in those chatbots, but if you don't, you can enable them with that drop-down menu in each of the tools. And with all prompts to a generative AI chatbot, not just the prompts or deep research reports, the information you enter first has a very strong effect on everything that comes out afterwards. Multiple studies over the past couple of years have shown that your first prompt and the details you provide in that first prompt most strongly affect all subsequent output from a chatbot in a single session. So when you're going to be prompting these deep research tools, the effective prompting techniques for deep research tools are fairly limited, constrained. There's a small list that you need to follow, and you're going to want to follow these guidelines. First, be very specific about your goal. I mean, really specific. I'll show you some examples coming up, but the more specific you are about exactly what you want that report to contain, the better the quality of that report will be. Next up, limit the use of documents. Don't attach documents. Don't do that because these tools will read through the entire document and look at irrelevant parts like conflict of interest statements or acknowledgments to colleagues and stuff like that, and will try to incorporate that into the report. You don't want that incorporated in the report, right? So if there's a part of a document you want to use, you're going to copy and paste that from the document into the prompt itself. These prompts can be really long, and that's fine, but don't attach whole documents. Copy and paste the relevant parts in the prompt. Next up, if there are constraints like only look at 2021 to 2022, tell it that. Be explicit about whatever constraints you might have. And then finally, you'll see an example of this in a second, but use delimiters like highlighting or tags in your text to structure these longer prompts. So the tools have a better idea of like, what's my goal? What are the constraints? What are the sources I should look at? And I'll show you examples of this in a section. But you're really going to focus on the how, not the what with these tools. You don't need to tell it to act as an expert. You don't need to tell it to search the web because that functionality is built into all deep research tools. Instead, focus on what is my goal? What is my objective? What exactly do I want to know and be able to do with that knowledge? And including this and being specific about what you want to do and be able to do with the knowledge will give you a much higher quality final report than otherwise. And you do need to turn on the thinking options or select the thinking models in the chatbot interface. Because the companies that run these tools want to save money, they often default to the fastest but worst performing models. This is why so many people got upset when ChatGPT 5 launched this summer. OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, wanted to save money, so they routed everyone to the cheapest to run and lowest performing model by default because that saved them money. And so GPT-5 was only slightly better than the previous version of ChatGPT, unless you selected the more advanced thinking model in the ChatGPT user interface. And the same thing goes with deep research tools. Chatbot makers default to their cheapest or at least sort of average performing models when you turn on the deep research option. You need to ensure that the thinking model or option is selected to get the best results. And you can see here where you can select the thinking model or turn on the thinking option in ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini. So really this combination of the most powerful available model in the thinking mode with the web search that's built into these tools will give you really the best possible results from deep research tools. So this is an example of a deep research prompt. I know there's a lot of text here, but I really want to point out the organization of this. So I have a very clear upfront objective, right? Analyze and outline the current gaps in the scheduling of emerging synthetic opioids under federal law, incorporating specific examples from 2023 DEA reports. I gave it a target audience. I gave it a scope of what I wanted to talk about: the current scheduling framework, characteristics of emerging synthetic opioids, scheduling challenges and gaps, consequences of regulatory gaps, and some final recommendations maybe to give to a legislative body. And I say at the end, here are the sources that I want you to focus on there. Again, there's a heavy emphasis on the what I want in this report, not how to go about building this report there, right? So I'm being explicit about what I want, not how to get there, because that's the job of the deep research tool. So I enter that prompt into Google Gemini, and after about 9 minutes, I receive my full report. It used 101 different sources that it found on the web, but only cited 38 of them. It produced me a 14-page report with tables and references at the end. Think about how long it would take you to create that same 14-page report. Now, you still have to evaluate the accuracy and the quality of the report, but the core work is done in a fraction of the time it would take to do a human to do the same work. And you can even see any reference cited in the report by clicking on the caret icon or the link icon for that reference. And this allows you to validate these references as you work to make sure that the chatbot isn't making anything up. And you don't always have to have a super structured long prompt to get good results. It's certainly helpful to have a physically structured prompt, especially when the report has broad scope. But if the report is narrower in scope, you don't have to be so detailed. So you can see that in this one, there's still a specific goal listed up front in this prompt, which is build a report that identifies and lists emerging methods of transportation used by drug trafficking organizations in Michigan. But there's also additional constraints like the audience and places where information should be sourced from. And what's interesting to do as you run these deep research reports is to scan through their thinking process. It'll show you that on the screen because you might uncover ideas or approaches that were ultimately discarded by the chatbot when it made its final report. And so after 13 minutes in this case, ChatGPT came back with a report on drug trafficking transportation methods in Michigan. Now, it only used 7 sources in this report, unlike the report I got from Gemini. And there were only 7 sources because my instructions stated, quote, the report should focus exclusively on emerging methods that are supported by peer review studies or governmental publications since 2023. And there aren't a lot of those reports specific to the Great Lakes area. So that's why I had a much smaller set of sources to draw from. But this particular report about emerging drug trafficking transportations in Michigan, excuse me, since 2023 includes highway corridor transport and advanced vehicle concealment, parcel and mail shipments, ghost luggage via air travel, which was surprising to me because US aviation regulations require that if your bag is on board, you have to be on board or your bag is removed. So I don't really know how that happens in real life. Unmanned aerial drones, maritime smuggling, believe it or not, via the Great Lakes, and exploitation of public transport. So all in all, pretty comprehensive. But I want to caution you about something that should be obvious, but is sometimes overlooked when we're dazzled by the speed and quality of these deep research tools. It's important to get validation from human experts before moving forward with a decision that could impact people's lives. When you generate deep research reports and you're not really, really well versed in that topic area, ask the chatbot for questions. You can ask colleagues who are experts on the topic before acting or making any policy decisions, heaven forbid, based on any of the information in that report. And that's what I've done here. After ChatGPT created the report, I simply said, what are 3 questions I can ask a human expert on this topic to verify the validity of the findings in this report? And it gave me, I think, 3 good questions I could actually ask an expert on drug trafficking methods in the Great Lakes region, or maybe elsewhere, right? To validate that the core results of the report are actually on target. So always, always verify. Because you should also, while you're at it, verify the sources that are cited. Remember, these tools make stuff up. They're very powerful pattern prediction machines, but they can make up totally false facts, or more commonly these days, references to studies, papers, and books that don't actually exist. This has become less and less of a problem over time, but it's still a really important problem for generative AI companies to solve because without trust, you won't have people using these tools to their full advantage. So we must view all output from generative AI tools through a critical lens. Advanced chatbots still make mistakes, they still make stuff up. But I think you should think about these deep research tools as kind of like a junior analyst considering the evidence or a research assistant surveying the state of the art. They're going to make mistakes, they're going to get stuff wrong, but in your area of expertise, you'll likely find the results interesting and very helpful in your job. And even with the potential for mistakes, these deep research tools have value. As leading figures from across academia and certainly the legal space repeatedly have stated, the time saved researching and writing vastly outclipses the time you will have to spend error checking. It's much faster. Yes, there'll be a few small errors, but it's much faster than doing this work on your own. And that's the real power of these reports, or really any generative AI tool, right? Time saved. This can be hours or days, depending on the complexity of topic and the breadth of available knowledge around the topic area. I'll tell you, I'd much rather start with a well-researched report created by a generative AI chatbot than starting with nothing when I have a project or presentation to deliver. I will not, however, turn that report in as my own. It is a sturdy launch pad to do my own work, but I'm still doing my own work. So I hope you can take what you learned today and go out, chat with a chatbot to perform data analysis or understand trends in a visualization or create a deep research report. Go try it out. It's very impressive and very powerful. Just remember, keep personally identifying information out of these tools and always validate any major conclusions that they come up with before taking action in your everyday substance misuse prevention work. So thank you. I know we're short on time. Chris or Rebecca has to jump in, but I'm going to stick around for 5 minutes and answer the questions that people put in the Q&A pod. If you have any more questions, please put them in the Q&A pod. I will gladly answer them for you. But back to Rebecca or Chris.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. I learned a lot, and I'm guessing other folks did as well. I will do just really quick ending slides so we can turn it back to Brian to answer those questions. I'm going to keep it short today. So let me go ahead and just share a couple of upcoming events that I wanted to make sure you all know about, and then I'll turn it back over to Brian. So we have our next couple of coffee break networking sessions happening on December 17th, which is tomorrow, as well as in January. If you want to network with other substance misuse prevention professionals, I encourage you to join us for those. We have an intermediate level preventionist training on, sorry, this covered up here on December 18th, Beyond the Generational Divide, Leveraging Workplace Differences for Prevention Success. So really looking at how can we leverage the different generations that are working within the substance misuse prevention workforce. We will continue our Foundations in Substance Misuse Prevention series on January 7th with What Does Not Work. We are going to have a training on January 20th of Hire Smart, Start Strong, Transforming Onboarding for Substance Misuse Prevention Professionals. Ricky Barton is going to present that. Prevention core competencies. If you are a Region 5 prevention person, we'd love for you to apply for this training. That's going to happen in February. Nicole Augustine and Ricky Barton are going to be the trainers for that. We only have about 12 slots left for that. So if you're interested in participating in that, I encourage you to apply really soon. And we're going to have Brian back on March 3rd for Be Your Own Spielberg, using storytelling techniques to create highly engaging and impactful presentations. You will not want to miss that. So with that, oh, whoops, one more. I forgot I added one more. We just opened up our next Foundations in Prevention Ethics course. This is a moderated, asynchronous online course that takes place over 2 weeks. Priority will be given to Region 5 substance misuse prevention professionals because this is part of continuing education requirements as well as requirements to become a certified prevention specialist. So we prioritize those folks for that training. So with that, I think we have another couple minutes, Brian, if you want to go ahead and answer any questions that have come up.
Sure, absolutely. And if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A pod. That's the easiest way for me to track them. And yes, I'm excited about giving my Spielberg talk. I actually teach health science communication, data visualization, but also actually health science communication. I love giving this presentation. It's a lot of fun. And I think people come away with some really good ideas for improving their own presentation skills and their own presentations in the future. But right now, there are 2 questions in the chat that I would like to answer. The first one is from Lucy, who asked, yeah, I never mentioned Grok. Just curious why. So Grok is another generative AI chatbot that is very powerful, has some very strong capabilities. But I don't mention Grok for 2 reasons. Well, there's one reason, and that's really my sort of ethical objection to the way in which Grok is trained and built. Grok relies very heavily. Grok is a chatbot from xAI, which is a company that's run by Elon Musk. xAI uses Grok and trains Grok on lots of data from the web, just like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini do. But Grok also relies very heavily on data that it gets from X, formerly known as Twitter. And for any of you who used to use Twitter, who might still use Twitter or X, you probably know that that platform has devolved, in my estimation, into a kind of cesspool of misinformation, disinformation, crypto bros, hustles, anger, hate speech. And unfortunately, Grok is in part trained on that. And Elon Musk's stated mission for Grok is to tell the truth. And unfortunately, the objective reality that most of us live in is not represented on the X platform. And there was actually a study that a group of researchers put out about a month ago that showed that the more large language models get information from X, the more likely they are, in the words of the researchers, to, quote, suffer from brain rot, meaning pulling up data that's not factual, misinformation, disinformation. So I really don't talk about Grok because of that issue. And there's been also a number of training issues around the way in which Elon Musk has trained this tool. He built a data center just outside of Memphis, Tennessee, that did not have its full permitting, did not go under environmental review, that used natural gas turbine engines spewing toxic fumes into the environment for about 4 months solid while training Grok 4. And that's part of Memphis has the highest per person or per population asthma incidence in the entire state of Tennessee. So I have a number of objections for not using Grok. And again, I speak as me, Brian. Thank you for your note, but I speak as me, Brian. I do not speak and represent Johns Hopkins or the Great Lakes PTTC when I say this, but that is my somewhat objective opinion and obviously influenced by my own sort of moral outrage at what they've done there. So that's why I don't talk about Grok. So sorry about that. So Brendan also asked, and this is a great question, Brendan. Are you at all concerned about AI chatbots lacking cultural humility and competence or potentially providing biased perspectives in responses based on interventions from the federal government and current administration? Should we try to stick to more objective data focused prompts, or is there room for more subjective analysis from these chatbots? And I think this is a really good question because someone asked earlier, what do we do about questions from today? From if I ask you to go look at the CDC website right now and talk about, ask questions about gender-related health, am I going to get accurate information? And I don't know that we can. So that's why I really try to focus on, again, on peer-reviewed studies that have been published, whether it's on a pre-publication platform like ARXIV or on the CDC's website or NIH or NSF or through tools like PubMed. Again, I try to really focus on those a lot more because I know they've been peer reviewed. But when it comes to the issue of cultural competence, one of the strategies I've used and I've seen some of my peers use at Johns Hopkins and even from some of the doctoral students who are there is to actually do a pre-prompt, like set up, like I was saying earlier in the session, I sort of have it look at the data file first and sort of get some context before I go into my analysis. I don't launch into my analysis. I like read the file first. So what I try to do and what my colleagues I've seen them do is do this kind of like sort of qualitative experiential prompt where it says, okay, we're going to be talking about X, but I want you to take a look at this from the perspective of someone you can insert name of marginalized population here, whether it's American Indians, Alaska Natives, Hispanics living in Florida, whatever it is. This is the perspective I want you to take. And while these tools don't really have a sense of cultural competence as we might define it for ourselves as human beings, it does force them to take on a perspective that the tool might otherwise not have and not consider at all when it's giving you responses to your questions. So again, if you're looking at marginalized populations, try to get it to work from that perspective of someone in that marginalized population because it will come up with insights that are much more appropriate to that population based on its training data set. And even then, it does have a series of challenges. This is going to work much better in the United States than other parts of the world. If you are doing, say, data analysis for rural populations in India, this generally does not work. Large rural population or large subsets of the rural population in India, for example, speaks Urdu. Urdu is one of the most commonly spoken languages on the planet, but it is not written down. And because these tools are largely trained on text, there's very little representation of Urdu and the people who speak Urdu inside of tools like ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, even the India-focused large language models that Indian companies have developed and trained on their own because they need text. And Urdu is primarily not a text-based language. So even while you might be able to say, focus on this perspective, if that perspective is not meaningfully represented in its training data set, it's not going to be able to give you useful answers. So I know it's a tough question to answer there, Brendan, but hopefully that gave you some ideas of how to approach that really challenging topic. All right. Yeah, you're welcome, Brendan. And I hadn't seen the ASPH's AIRI chatbot, but it might be useful to look at that as well. Yeah. All right, there's no more questions. Oh, wait. Najat asked really quickly, have I used chatbots to do qualitative analysis? Yes. Chatbots are really transforming qualitative analysis because they are really good at finding patterns across large amounts of text. So a really simple example that I actually cited in my presentation last week is I use chatbots to do qualitative analysis on survey data, open-ended questions to survey data. So for example, I teach 5 classes at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I teach about 1,000 students a year. One of those classes has about 600 students in it. And there's, of course, at the end of the year, end of the term, these open-ended course evaluation with open-ended questions like, how would this course be improved? Or what, how could this course, what did you like about the course? Whatever it is. Open-ended qualitative questions. And I could scan through 600 responses and try to pull out data myself. Or I just dump that information because it's already anonymized. There's no student names attached, so I'm not violating FERPA, which is a student privacy law. And I get back the major trends. So it's really useful, I think, to do qualitative analysis. There are some tools that are building in. If you're a qualitative analysis person, I would recommend you take a look at MaxQDA. I don't know if everybody knows MaxQDA. It's a great qualitative analysis tool that a number of my colleagues who focus on qualitative data analysis at Bloomberg highly recommend and use themselves. And it's added in large language model backends to it to improve its analysis across large swaths of text. So very, very, very powerful tool as well. All right, so we're a bit over 7 minutes over. I just want to say thanks to everybody. Really appreciated your time. Really appreciated your contributions. Thanks to Chris and Rebecca. I love giving these talks, and hopefully I will see you or some of you at one of my future talks. Thanks a lot.